The first time I noticed something wrong, I told myself it was the wind. I told myself that for 3 weeks, even when the air was perfectly still. My name is Dale Hennessy, and I farm 200 acres of corn and soybeans in rural Ashford County, Iowa, right off Route 30, about 15 miles east of where the highway turns into nothing but gravel and cornfields stretching to the horizon. I've lived on this land my whole life, inherited it from my father, who inherited it from his. I know every fence post, every drainage ditch, every single acre of dirt under my boots better than I know my own face. That familiarity is what made what happened so impossible to ignore. There's a quarter-mile stretch along my eastern property line where I keep 3 scarecrows in the cornfield, placed there years ago to discourage the starlings from roosting in the stalks when the ears start to form. They're nothing fancy. Wooden crosses wrapped in old flannel shirts, stuffed with straw, topped with pumpkins for heads during October. Simple, practical, ugly things. The kind of thing you'd walk past 1,000 times without a second glance. But 3 weeks ago last Tuesday, I walked out to check on the irrigation lines after a dry spell, and I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw that the leftmost scarecrow had turned around. It was facing the house now instead of the road. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck start to rise. I told myself, like I said, that it was the wind. I turned around and went back inside and poured myself a whiskey and didn't think about it again until the next morning, when I looked out the kitchen window and saw that it had turned back around. Or maybe it had never turned at all, and I'd just been looking at it wrong. I'd been drinking the night before, after all. It's easy to see things wrong when you've been drinking, but then it happened again, and again. Every few days, I'd look out and one of them would be facing a different direction, or leaning at an odd angle, or standing closer to the house than it had been the day before. I started keeping a log on my phone, time-stamped photos, because I knew that if I told anyone about this without proof, they'd think I was losing my mind. Sarah, my sister who lives in Des Moines, she'd been on my case for months about how I was spending too much time alone out here after the divorce, how isolation was doing things to my head. And maybe she had a point. Maybe sitting in this farmhouse, night after night, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the creak of old wood for company, maybe that was enough to make a man start seeing things that weren't there. But I wasn't imagining it. I took those photos religiously, morning and evening, and I watched the pattern emerge like a rhythm I couldn't quite understand. The scarecrows were moving when I wasn't watching. At first, I thought about animals, raccoons maybe, or deer rubbing their antlers against the wooden posts. But these weren't delicate adjustments. These were deliberate repositionings, as if someone or something was testing different arrangements, trying to find the right configuration. And there was something else, something I couldn't articulate, but that made my stomach turn every time I looked at the photos side by side. The expressions carved into the old pumpkins, the ones I'd barely noticed for years, seemed different, subtler, more focused, as if they were paying attention to me. I gave it 2 more weeks before I couldn't take it anymore. 2 more weeks of checking my photos every morning, of lying awake at night listening to the house settle around me, of feeling watched every time I walked out to my truck. The logical part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 3 decades of farming, through bad seasons and worse markets, and a marriage that fell apart because I loved this land more than I could ever love another person. That part kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Equipment malfunction, trick of the light, Some bored teenagers from town who thought it would be funny to mess with the old man out in the country. But teenagers don't come out here. There's nothing for them. And there was no equipment, no light, no explanation that could account for what I was seeing. So, on a Saturday morning in late September, when the air had that crispness to it that always made me feel like the world was holding its breath, I grabbed a flashlight and a box cutter, and I walked out to the eastern cornfield. I was going to inspect the scarecrows up close. I was going to figure out what was going on, once and for all, and I was going to fix it. The corn was tall by then, 6 feet easy, and I had to push through the dry stalks to reach the property line. The first 2 scarecrows looked normal. The same worn flannel shirts, the same wooden crosses I'd built years ago, the same blank pumpkins staring out at the road. I examined them closely, running my hands along the posts, checking the joints where the wood met the wood. Nothing loose, nothing out of place. They were solid, anchored deep into the ground, exactly as I'd left them. But when I got to the third one, the leftmost, the one that started all of this, I felt my heart drop into my boots before I even understood what I was looking at. The wooden cross was gone. The crossbeam was missing entirely, removed cleanly, as if it had never been there at all. And the shirt, my father's old flannel, the red and black one I'd worn until it fell apart, and then repurposed for the scarecrow because I couldn't bear to throw it away. The shirt was standing upright on its own, perfectly still, perfectly rigid, filled with something that was not straw. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only seconds, staring at that shirt, trying to make my brain understand what my eyes were seeing. The fabric was stretched tight, pulled into a human shape. The sleeves extended outward as if the invisible arms inside were reaching for something, or holding something. I could see the faint outline of fingers at the end of the sleeves, frozen in place, and at the collar, there was a shape that could only be a head. But there was no pumpkin. There was no wooden frame. There was nothing holding this shirt up except whatever was inside it. And whatever was inside was standing perfectly, impossibly still in the middle of my cornfield. I took a step closer, then another. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, moving without my permission. I told myself I was going to reach out and touch the fabric. I told myself I was going to solve the mystery once and for all. But when I got close enough to see inside the collar, when I leaned in and looked up at that empty space where a face should have been, I saw nothing. Not darkness, not shadow, just nothing. An absence so complete that it made my eyes water and my head throb. And then the shirt moved. Not much. Just a slight tilt, like a head turning to look down at me. And I heard, or felt, or imagined a sound that I can only describe as a whisper made of cold. It was the sound of breath that wasn't breath, of words that weren't words, of something trying to communicate through a medium that humans weren't meant to perceive. I stumbled backward, fell, scrambled to my feet, and I ran. I ran all the way back to the farmhouse, slammed the door behind me, and stood there with my back against the wood, gasping for air that tasted like copper and fear. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair by the window with the lights on and the shotgun across my lap, watching the cornfield, waiting for something I couldn't name to come walking toward me through the rows. Nothing came. But in the morning when the sun finally rose and I forced myself to look outside, I saw that both of the other scarecrows had changed. Their wooden crosses were still there, but the shirts were empty, discarded on the ground like shed skins. And standing in their place were 2 more upright shapes, wrapped in the same phantom fabric, facing the house. I called the sheriff that morning. Deputy Rogers came out, a good old boy I'd known since high school, and I walked him out to the field and showed him the scarecrows. I showed him the photos on my phone, the timestamps, the progression of changes that I had documented so carefully. I showed him the empty shirt on the wooden cross, and I watched his face as he examined it, looking for the reaction I expected. The skepticism, the suggestion that I needed to lay off the whiskey, the polite but firm recommendation that I see someone about my mental health. But he didn't do any of that. He just stared at the shirt for a long time. And then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the world was much, much bigger and much, much stranger than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. He told me he'd file a report. He told me he'd send someone out to take a look around. He told me to lock my doors and call if I saw anything else. And then he left, and I never heard from him again. No one came to take a look around. No one called to ask follow-up questions. It was like the whole thing had been erased from existence, absorbed back into the fabric of a reality that suddenly felt paper-thin and utterly unreliable. The scarecrows kept moving. Now they didn't just change positions, they got closer. One morning there were 3 of them, arranged in a semicircle around the farmhouse, about 50 yards from the back door. The next morning there were 5, pressed in tighter, and I could see that they weren't empty anymore. There were shapes inside the shirts now. Human-shaped shadows standing perfectly still, facing the windows, facing the doors, facing me every time I looked. I stopped going outside. I boarded up the windows on the first floor, moved all the food and water I could carry upstairs, and set up a makeshift barricade at the bottom of the staircase. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that whatever this was, it was just a phenomenon, something natural that I didn't understand, something that would resolve itself if I just waited long enough. But on the 3rd night of my self-imposed imprisonment, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway downstairs. Not the creak of old wood settling, not the wind rattling a loose shutter. Real footsteps, heavy, deliberate, unhurried, and they were coming up the stairs. I grabbed the shotgun, the same one I'd been holding for 3 days, loaded with shells I'd loaded myself, pointed at a door that suddenly seemed very far away. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I could hear breathing on the other side of the wood, not the breathing of anything alive, something slower, deeper, a rhythm that matched the pulsing in my temples and the pounding of my heart, as if whatever was out there was trying to sync itself with my fear, drinking it in, savoring it. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like the memory of a voice, the impression of words shaped in air that had never known sound. It said my name. It said my name in a tone that sounded almost human, almost familiar, almost like someone I had known and loved a very long time ago. My father's voice, or what I remembered of it. "Dale," it said, "we've been waiting for you. We've been waiting such a long time." I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, as the door handle began to turn, slowly, inch by inch. And through the gap, I saw the fabric first. My father's red and black flannel shirt, the one I'd put on the scarecrow because I couldn't bear to throw it away. It was standing in the doorway, filling the space, blocking out the light from the hallway. And inside it, I could see the shape of something that was almost human. Almost. It took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned under its weight, and I saw that its head, the space where its head should have been, was filled with nothing but that same terrible absence I'd seen in the cornfield. The void, the emptiness, The thing that wore my father's clothes and spoke in my father's voice and stood in my doorway like it had every right to be there. It took another step and another, and I could feel the cold radiating off it, the absolute zero of a thing that had never known warmth, never known life, never known anything at all except hunger and patience and the terrible certainty that it would get what it came for. You left us out there, it said, in the field, in the cold, for so long, and I understood then what had happened. The scarecrows had never been mine. They had been something else's, a marker, a signal, a call that had gone out into the dark and waited, year after year, decade after decade, for someone to answer. And I had answered. The day I put on that flannel shirt, the day I stood in the cornfield and felt the wind on my face and the earth beneath my feet, I had answered. I had invited them in, and now they were here, and there was nowhere left to run. The last thing I remember is the cold, spreading through my chest like frost on a window pane, and the feeling of my own body becoming rigid, becoming still, becoming something that would stand in a field forever, waiting for the next person to come along and make the same mistake I did. They found me 3 days later, or what was left of me, standing in the eastern cornfield, wearing the red and black flannel shirt, arms extended outward, face turned toward the house. The deputy said my eyes were open. He said I was smiling. He said that when they tried to move me, I felt lighter than I should have, as if something inside had hollowed me out and filled the empty space with straw and silence. And every night, when the wind blows through the corn and the shadows stretch long across the fields, they say you can still hear me whispering, calling out to anyone who's listening, telling them to come closer, telling them to look into the void, telling them that the scarecrows are waiting, and they've been waiting such a very, very long time.